Got it. Thanks.
Thanks.
Should I go ahead now? Well, welcome everyone. My name is Damian Murphy, and I'm the Senior Vice President for the National Security and International Policy Department here at the Center for American Progress. And I want to thank you all for joining us for this important conversation about developments in Iran. Over the past 2 weeks, widespread anti-government protests have spread across Iran, evolving into one of the most serious challenges to the regime since the Islamic Revolution. The government's response has been nothing short of cataclysmic. Security forces have killed thousands. Some estimates suggest even tens of thousands, and the country is in a near nationwide communications blackout. In the past 2 days, President Donald Trump has publicly urged Iranians to keep protesting, has announced 25% tariffs on countries doing business with Iran, and continues to warn of military action. What U.S. military action might look like in Iran remains uncertain, and the massive deployments outside of Venezuela that remain may constrain the use of force in the region. In response, Tehran has promised retaliation against U.S. targets in the region if military action were to move forward. To help us make sense of these developments, we have 3 esteemed guests who have joined us today. But before introducing them, I'd like to encourage the audience to submit questions through our Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll be sure to address them throughout the discussion. So let's get started. First, I want to introduce Jason Rezaian, who is the director of the Press Freedom Initiative at The Washington Post. He served as the Post correspondent in Tehran from 2012 to 2016, and he spent 544 days unjustly imprisoned by Iranian authorities until his release in January of 2016. He also serves as a CNN contributor. Second, I want to introduce Gisu Nia, who is the director of the Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council, where she works on the prevention and accountability efforts for atrocity crimes, human rights violations, terrorism, and corruption offenses around the world. She also serves as board chair of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, where she is helping to develop and oversee the group's human rights advocacy and legal programs. Finally, we're joined by Andrew Miller, who's a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress. He most recently served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli-Palestinian Affairs at the U.S. Department of State from 2022 to 2024. And prior to this, served as a senior policy advisor to U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield at the United Nations. So let's get right into the conversation here. Very dynamic environment that we're dealing with. Literally, news is kind of changing by the minute here. But maybe to set the table, Gisu, I'll turn to you to start. Can you walk us through the events of these past 2 weeks, and how do these protests compare to those that we saw in 2022 and at other stages in Iran's history?
Well, thank you for having me for this panel and for this discussion at such a critical time. So thanks to the organizers. Iran has seen successive waves of nationwide protests for about a decade now. Beginning in December 2017. Of course, there were protests in June 2009 with a disputed presidential election in the country that brought millions to the street. But that was more about people disputing the results of the vote, and it was kind of appealing more to institutions. It wasn't as robustly calling for the regime to be gone in total. What we've seen since December 2017 is that the chants are very unequivocal and very much about the regime needing to go. There are chants of death to the dictator, and also critiques of the Islamic Republic of Iran's foreign policy. So there's been successive waves of protests from in December 2017, January 2018, again in November 2019, and then beginning in September 2022 with the Women Life Freedom Movement, which was triggered by the tragic killing of Mahsa Jina Amini, who was a young Kurdish Iranian woman who was alleged to have worn improper hijab and died in the custody of the Islamic Republic of Iran's morality police. And that was perhaps the biggest threat to the system. But now with these current protests, and so these began on December 28th. They've lasted for more than 2 weeks now, but they began on December 28th. And the initial trigger was the free fall of Iran's currency. So at the time that the protests began more than 2 weeks ago, the rial had lost half its value since just September. And essentially, there were shopkeepers in Tehran's bazaars that came out and they just couldn't sell their goods day to day because inflation was so out of control. And so that's what really brought them to organize a strike and hit the streets. And they're really the lifeblood of Iran's economy. So that was quite telling in terms of, where this would go. But what we saw after that was that it widened, the protests widened a lot more. They were joined by students on university campuses and also Iranians who just didn't know how to make ends meet, who are struggling to put food on the table. It's not even a question of luxuries. It's really a question of, can people buy bread? And so while there was an economic trigger, the protests quickly took a very anti-regime nature and character. And then we saw that there were massive protests this past Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. This followed a few things. One, the son of the deposed Shah, Reza Pahlavi, issued a call to protesters to take to the streets. Also, President Trump in the US had issued a statement on Truth Social just a few days prior to Reza Pahlavi, the son of the deposed Shah, calling for that, and had said that if any Islamic Republic of Iran officials kill protesters, that the US would be, quote, locked and loaded and ready to intervene. So I believe that gave a sense to Iranians who took to the streets that they were somehow, that they somehow had support, and that if they came out, they might not face lethal violence, or if they did, there would be some kind of response from the Trump administration. And so I think that's what led to such large numbers coming to the streets, though, of course, there are also just hundreds of thousands of disaffected Iranians that simply don't know how to pay for basic necessities and don't see any route forward other than this regime stepping down and a new form of governance taking over. Now, what we've seen has been incredibly disturbing. So there's been a communications blackout in the country. We're going on 144 hours now of a communications blackout. That means that it's very difficult to have any kind of internet service or also even make calls. Yesterday, a lot of people were finally, like colleagues of mine and those in our network, were finally able to connect to family, friends, and others in Iran in very, very brief, short phone calls because landlines had been down. And what we heard was horrific. There were descriptions of wartime situations on the street, of government forces using military-grade weaponry. A US-based human rights group, Harana, has said that there's more than 2,000 protesters that have been killed, but a media diaspora station, Iran International, has said that the number is 12,000 and that is a conservative estimate. In speaking to different Iran human rights organizations that look at this kind of information and are looking at the videos of bodies piled up in hospital floors, of bodies in morgues, of the other kind of videos, the very few and limited videos that we've received via Starlink in the country, that we've seen, just military-grade weaponry just being shot indiscriminately into large crowds. They've said that the 12,000 number is credible. And of course, it will take months to properly verify how many killings indeed occurred. But they're saying that it could be in the double-digit thousands. Now, if that is the case, that would put the scale of the killing on par with the Rwandan genocide in the 90s, for folks who remember that. And of course, we saw Al Fashir in Sudan and the massacre that happened there of 60,000 not too long ago. But it's in those kinds of numbers. So this is one of the biggest mass atrocities in modern history. It will take some time to make sure that the data is verified and to the extent possible, but all the early indications are showing that this is an atrocity at a mass scale. And so right now, just to wrap this up, the protests have obviously quelled because of the chilling nature of what is essentially a bloodbath. People who have given us some direct firsthand, witness, anecdotal observations have said things like a colleague had said that her sister walked out on the street one night and 3 boys were shot in front of her. Somebody else said people are just going out. Sometimes they're not even part of the protest. They just went out to go buy bread or milk or whatnot, and they were just shot. So it looks like the security forces have just been shooting indiscriminately at crowds. It's not a crowd control method. There are tear gas and other things you can use to control crowds. Shooting live ammunition at people in the face and in their upper abdomen is not a crowd control tactic. And certainly in these numbers, there would be nothing to support that. So it is an atrocity at a mass scale. We see that the protests are quieting. I do see videos that are being shared on X and other platforms claiming that the protests are continuing in large force. That's protest footage from last Thursday. That is not the case right now based on everything that we've heard. And that is the state of play at the moment.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that grim, but really comprehensive, summation as to where we are. Why don't we turn to Jason? And I'd be curious, Jason, for your understanding for the significance of these protests as a threat to the regime. We've seen brutal use of force, and Gia did such a good job of describing how terrible it's been. But in your view, what does that tell us about the regime dynamics, and what are you looking for in the coming days and weeks?
Well, thank you for including me in this important conversation. I would agree with everything that Gisu said so far. And one layer of maybe extra context I would add to it, and we've seen the regime shut the internet and other communications down multiple times over the years, dating back to the Green Movement and the protests that followed the 2009 re-election of Ahmadinejad. What's different about it now is just how important internet connectivity is to all aspects of Iranian life, including the financial and economic lifelines of that country. So the fact that the regime that is dealing with the collapse of the currency and a whole host of economic challenges would be willing to absorb the massive costs of shutting down communications for, 6 days at this point, gives you an indication of how real a threat this is to them and their perceived longevity and the existential threat that it poses to the system. I think it's probably very difficult for us to know exactly what's happening in the country right now for that very reason that we've been locked out of these communications. We will reestablish communications in the coming days. And when that happens, as Gisu indicated, it'll be a process of piecing together what has happened. And that documentation is incredibly important for understanding what to do next in response to these atrocities, what to do moving forward. But I also think that that can't replace the very immediate needs of how do we keep the lights on and the windows into Iranian societies open. Every time protests have happened there, dating back to those 2009 protests, the international community led by the United States, regardless of Democrat or Republican administrations, has said, we will figure this out. We're going to keep, this will never happen again. right?
Yeah.
We'll ensure that the next time around, Iranians are able to connect. The technology exists. The political will apparently has not existed so far to ensure that Iranians are able to stay online. So, I think that there's still a lot more that we can do in the outside world to help Iranians. And I'm not sure that the Trump administration has a very clear idea of what that could or should look like. I heard former National Security Advisor John Bolton saying that attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities would be sort of a shot in the arm to protesters. I don't know that that's actually true, and I think the idea of going after military installations that helps open up even further our bandwidth and Israel's bandwidth to attack Iran by air. But I don't know, again, what that would solve at this moment. So I think there's not a lot of great options. And unfortunately, the calls for change in Iran are not new. The spark of these protests were clearly economic in nature, but the fact that they've spread to every region of the country, and this is a vast country that is not a monolith in any way. You have multiple ethnic groups, multiple religions, multiple languages, and there's sort of a call and response that's going on since the 2022 protests that are very supportive of one another, which is a new development in the protests in Iran. So I think harnessing that energy and figuring out how to really support and clearly respond to the aspirations of people is the challenge ahead of us. And I hope that we're up to it. I'm not sure that we are.
Well, on that note, why don't we turn to Andrew, for your views on how President Trump in particular is seeing this issue. I know it's always a difficult question to ask you to, crawl inside his head and understand where he's coming from. But, he has said that he would intervene on behalf of protesters on multiple occasions now. What do you see as his interests, and what are the constraints that he's facing in considering the use of force?
Well, it's great to be on this panel with Jason and Gisu and their expertise and experience, and certainly, my heart's with them and any family members who are in the line of fire, either literally or figuratively, throughout this. As you know, Damien, it's very difficult to try to divine what President Trump is thinking and why he's doing what he's doing at any given point in time. But I do think the intervention in Venezuela is instructive. And there's unfortunately probably very little overlap between President Trump's interests and his motivations and that of the Iranian people. I think President Trump is probably motivated by three things. One, he wants to be able to cast himself as the hero. And when I say cast himself, he wants the image of being a hero. Whether he is actually the hero or not, whether he's successful is less important than whether he can tell a story that he's the hero. And he's so adept at managing the narrative, particularly in the United States and with certain constituencies in this country, it doesn't require actually helping to protect the Iranian people. The second is he wants to display the military prowess of the U.S. Armed Services. He wants to be perceived as strong. He wants to show what the U.S. military can do in these instances. And then the third interest, which I think is probably subordinate to the first two, is seize on any opportunity to get a governing arrangement in Iran that is more pliable to his interests. And that doesn't necessarily mean regime change. As we saw in Venezuela, I don't think we had regime change. We had a facelift of the regime, but Trump is, gambling that it will be more favorable to his economic interest, to the oil companies' interest in the United States, and that is sufficient. So it's very conceivable that even if President Trump were to intervene and he were to appear to score some victory in Iran, he would reach an agreement with elements of the Islamic Republic at the expense of the Iranian people who have been so bravely protesting. So I think we need to be very conscious that the Iranian people aren't his audience. They're not the ones he's actually trying to win over. In terms of, oh, perfect, my light decided to go up, but
we can still see you.
In any event, I think in terms of the military or the options that he has, as Jason was alluding to, they're actually quite limited. And the military, in particular, the Air Force or the U.S. Navy, are not in a strong position to defend protesters from the air. They can't lower a protective bubble over demonstrators to insulate them from the onslaught of Iranian security services. That's not something that they're able to do. And even deploying forces on the ground, which President Trump has ruled out, would be a very complicated affair in urban environments, in close proximity. There almost certainly would be a lot of chaos. There would be U.S. soldiers probably not only getting hurt themselves and killed themselves, but accidentally killing Iranian demonstrators. The best way to protect Iranian demonstrators in the short term would be to remove the tooth, as it were. And President Trump has not endorsed regime change, nor is that something that we've had success doing in any context. It comes with enormous risks, both for the United States and for the country in which we've tried to achieve regime change. So there aren't many good military options. And I think, as you alluded to at the outset, Damien, with our focus on Venezuela, with the continued focus on Greenland, with other U.S. military obligations, we don't have the same assets available in the Middle East that we did only a few months ago. And that's less relevant to being able to conduct a military operation in Iran than it is in defending against retaliation. I think President Trump is probably discounting or dismissing the extent to which the Iranians can retaliate. That's not to say that the Iranians can deliver devastating retaliation, but they're certainly capable of firing missiles. A lot of the ships and air defense systems that we would want in place are not in theater at the moment, and it does take time to move them. And there is a trade-off associated with taking them from one theater to the next. So there are all of these limitations associated with making those trade-offs, and he has to take them into account. But I do think the principal limiting factor for the president is the history of the United States in the region. He seems to think he has solved the puzzle of the United States in military intervention, where he came into power railing against U.S. entanglements abroad that have led to prolonged occupations, prolonged military interventions. He's concluded that the way you do it is through air power and special operations. You go in, you achieve it, and you get out. Obviously, that's an oversimplification, and anyone with a remedial understanding of military affairs know that is not a lasting recipe for success. But President Trump seems to be high on his own product and believes that it can be replicated in other cases. And he may believe the same combination of actions could produce somewhat similar results within Iran. I don't think the results actually produced what he believes they did in Venezuela and on other locations. They almost certainly wouldn't achieve the same results in Iran, but that doesn't matter for the moment if he's operating on the assumption that air power and special operations will enable him to achieve strategic effects without the risk of getting bogged down on the ground. He may be inclined to move in that direction. And just quickly closing the question, President Trump, at the same time that he has invested records amount of money in the military, which he's very proud to crow about, asking for over $1 trillion in funding, he's systematically undercut every other tool of U.S. power. State Department, USAID, those are precisely the departments and agencies that could theoretically begin to answer the call for helping the Iranian people in areas like connectivity and finding solutions to provide relief in a number of contexts. It's not easy, but potentially it could be done. And as we've discussed, one of the things that could be done, and this wouldn't have to happen through government channels, you could smuggle and essentially flood Iran with the Starlink terminals. There are some there, but they're extremely expensive. They appear to have temporarily found a solution to the disruptions and jamming by the Iranians with the help of the Russians and the Chinese. Elon is capable of overcoming them and his engineers. It's worth investing in that. It's not a long-term solution, but if you want to give Iranians access, which we do, to information, if you want to facilitate communications, Elon has already given free access to the services, but you need the you need the hardware in order to do so. This is the time for Elon to stand up, to do President Trump's bidding, as it were, and make it available. It's going to be dangerous. It always is with smuggling, but that's precisely what the Iranian people need more than anything else in terms of being able to maintain solidarity, to organize responses. That's the least that can be done now. And President Trump can simply give an order or give an instruction to his former advisor, and that project can start. Why it hasn't happened, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And, just going back to something that you said towards the end of your remarks about, President Trump undermining and eroding so many tools of U.S. power over the course of this past year. Just today, here at the Center for American Progress, we've rolled out a tracker that quantifies, how that's played out over this past year, and hopefully will be a useful resource to folks, on this call, but across the policymaking community. Let's go back to Gisu, and my predicate for these two questions is that we understand there's a lack of information coming out of Iran. It's very, very difficult to truly understand the scale of what's going on inside the country. But with that said, I'd be really curious for your insights on two issues. One is how you think protesters on the ground are responding to President Trump's threats for the use of force, right? What is their reaction to that? What are you seeing through your networks on that front? And then one from the audience: is there any evidence that regular armed forces are present on the ground and contributing to the repression? And how have different parts of the regime, different elements of the security forces, responded to what's going on the ground there?
Great. Thank you so much. I just wanted to follow up on one thing on Starlink, because it's really important. And I know there might be some people in the crowd who can help with this, or in the audience who can help with this. But we're actually pushing for direct to cell to be turned on for Iranians. And so as was pointed out by Andrew, we need more Starlink dishes, of course, in the country, but there's around 50K Starlink dishes. That's the estimate inside Iran, smuggled through black markets. But each dish costs, $500+ Like it's not a cheap solution. The people that we do speak to through Starlink are people that tend to be more well off. For example, we have very little connectivity with the provinces. And the regime is also, jamming these GPS signals. Probably, I've been told, through the aid of the Russians and some of the technology that they have. And so connections have dropped to 80% less than at the start of the shutdown for that reason. But these satellites, I mean, we already have satellites overhead, and there's a way to enable turning this on, but it really, and all you would need is your smartphone, and it can be any smartphone issued after 2020. So any smartphone, which is what most Iranians have. So if it's any smartphone issued after 2020, there's a way to be able to link into this. And that way this could reach millions, not just thousands. The catch is that it can only be done through local phone carriers. So for example, that's how it works in Ukraine with Kyivstar. But Iran's carriers are controlled by the regime, so you can see why that's not an immediate fix. But somebody can flip the switch without them. And so there's some sovereignty issues at play, but I think it would be easy to overcome those given the precedent of other decisions that we've seen on this kind of connectivity. And so SpaceX can potentially turn this on. They're operational now. They're just waiting for FCC approval for a major upgrade. Apple, in theory, can do it. The US government could do it. So there are ways to do this. And essentially, you would just need to switch this on. And then that avoids the need for equipment. And quite happy to send a brief written by one of my colleagues on this for anybody who's interested. Maybe that can be circulated. I know that there's current conversations within US government right now about how to fast track that, but that's really something that would be critical. And because this is a recurring problem, as Jason mentioned, this isn't the first time we've experienced this kind of shutdown. We really need a solution moving forward. In terms of the questions that you asked, so how protesters are responding, well, I had already alluded to this in my initial remarks, but I do believe that it had President Trump's threats of use of force really had a galvanizing impact on protesters. And I think that's one reason that the casualties are so high, because so many people came out in such a bold way. I think it's also inescapable that Iranians saw what happened in Venezuela. So seeing the capture of Maduro in such a bold manner obviously led to many Iranians questioning whether a similar thing would be done with the Islamic Republic of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. I think in the case of Ali Khamenei, it would be more of a shoot to kill situation, less of a capture and bringing him back to U.S. court, especially since there's no indictment against him in U.S. courts as a head of state, where the head of state immunity hadn't been bypassed in the way that it has been in the situation of Maduro, where the U.S. and many other countries, in fact, don't recognize him as the legitimate head of state, but that's a bit of a different situation. So Iranians obviously saw that, and it's given a lot of, I would say, energy to their efforts to come out. And that's definitely very present in online discussions, or at least prior online discussions before we had this communications blackout, and from what we're hearing. And I guess there's the question of how responsible a statement like that is when it leads to such an impact. Very quickly on the question of security forces, we saw that anti-riot police were the ones that were brought out initially. And then, of course, that's followed up by other branches of the police, of the military, and also, the intelligence obviously having a role in the IRGC. So it's very much following a playbook of prior protests where these different security forces come out in waves. There are unconfirmed reports right now of potential support from elsewhere. I don't want to speak on that just yet. I'm getting some reports today that are supposed to confirm some of this external support that's coming to shore up the response. But it's pretty much the same actors that have been held responsible or not held responsible, but who are responsible for the violence of prior protests, including the crackdown on the November 2019 protests and the protests in 2022.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jason. Two things. One of them is a question from the audience. A few days ago, Iran's foreign minister expressed a willingness to engage and hold talks with the West, with the United States in response to Trump's threats. Since then, Trump has said that he's not meeting with anyone in the Iranian government right now. So it may be moot right now, but I'd just be curious for how you see the foreign minister's comments in terms of how the regime is positioning itself vis-a-vis the West. And then Gisu raised this in her opener about the role of the Bazaris, right, and how the sort of genesis of these protests started there. I'd be curious for your views on that as well. What is the significance of seeing such open defiance from folks running the bazaars across the country, actually, not just in Tehran?
I had a little gap. Recap the first question for me. There was a sound gap.
Oh, sorry about that. On the Iranian foreign minister's comments about expressing a willingness to engage with the United States.
Look, I think that his job is to, obviously downplay what's happening in the streets and do whatever he can to buy time for the regime. I'll tell you that I have always been someone who is a firm believer that engagement with friends and foes alike is a demonstration of strength, not weakness. This time around, I don't think that there's much in the way of concessions or things that the regime has on offer that are much value to the United States, other than we promise to keep our hands off of people. And that's not a promise that we could put very much stock in because they've never done that before. So, I think it just goes to show how scared they are right now. And I don't put a lot of stock in that. But similarly, just because President Trump said that he's not willing to negotiate with them right now, it was less than 72 hours ago that he said, they desperately want to talk and I'm ready to talk to them. So, I think, and I've written about this in the past and recently, as much as I don't like many of the Trump administration policies, in a way, he sort of the Iranians have met their match in him. He's much more unpredictable than any of his predecessors. And, they are the ones who have often been able to succeed in non-traditional circumstances, right? And it's this element of surprise. If you recall, back in June, just before the U.S. bombed nuclear facilities in Iran, he was talking about negotiating with them, right? So, there's this kind of give and take back and forth, and I just don't think we know from one moment to the next what's actually going to happen. But I can clearly see that the Islamic Republic is more scared of the swirling storms around them than I've ever experienced in the quarter century that I've been working on Iran.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the Bazari involvement, I think it's symbolically very important, right? That's the merchant class. And we talk about Iran as a theocracy, but it's also very capitalistic society, and the Bazaris have been at the foundation of that for centuries. The bazaar itself is less influential than it was 50 years ago, at the time of the Islamic Revolution. But I think if they lose that support, it's a very symbolically important faction within the country that there are very few support structures left besides the armed forces, military, and the security apparatus. And as of now, we haven't seen any signs of any of those groups flipping.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, let's shift to the geopolitical. Curious for your views as to how Israel is seeing the situation, the Gulf countries, Russia, China. Give us your views on how you're seeing the geopolitics of this.
Well, for Israel, certainly at the outset of the protests, as they were gaining steam and growing in size, there was a great deal of excitement. Because for the Israelis, their view all along was the problem that Iran presented, the threat that Iran presented, was not any particular weapon system or particular technology. It was the regime itself. And the regime would have to go in order for Israel to be secure. And they saw this as the best opportunity to finally rid themselves of the Islamic Republic, to rid themselves of the mullahs. And they were not in any way hesitant to continue to embrace the former crown prince, or the crown prince, depending on your view on that issue. While the Israelis have not played any overt role in terms of action within Iran, it does seem likely that the Israelis have been involved, at the very least covertly, and there are at least some signs that they may be involved in amplifying, certain algorithms that overrepresent the Reza's coverage on social media platforms because of the historical relationship between Israel and the Shah, the historical relationship between Israel and the Crown Prince. If Israel had a vote on who would become the leader of Iran, they would select the Crown Prince without hesitation, because they believe there is a coincidence of interest. So for Israel, this is going to be the opportunity, and even if the protests are quelled and they do quiet down substantially, they're going to view this as an open wound that they can pick at, and as evidence that the Islamic Republic is on its last legs, and will be advocating with the Trump administration and others for opportunities to bring about the downfall of Khamenei and the entire Islamic Republic. So the Israeli view, I think, is the most clear, is the most unqualified in that respect. From the Gulf's perspective, I think there's a degree of ambivalence where they're certainly not fans of the Islamic Republic, but the Gulfies have adopted a somewhat more conservative posture whereby they preferred the predictability of the status quo over the uncertainty of an unconstrained Iran. For them, it was less like with Israel, the threat of the nuclear program. It was the rivalry of an Iran that was unleashed economically and militarily, that could compete with them in oil markets, in commercial activities, without any type of impediments, that would be able to fully develop their military and pose a threat to the scattered Gulf countries. They were relatively content with the status quo and developing their own relationships with Iran. And in recent years, each Gulf country was seeking to maintain some type of relationship with Iran, including Saudi Arabia, which was one of the last countries in the Gulf to reach the conclusion that they needed some type of modus vivendi. If the Islamic Republic does ultimately collapse, they will adjust to the new reality, but they're probably not going to be pushing for a change, because change in and of itself is somewhat discomforting for the Gulf countries. When you take it internationally, I think for the Russians, it is a major concern. It's not existential, but we know the cooperation from Russia and Iran has been critical at some points in time. If this had happened 2.5 years ago, it would have been a bigger problem for Russia, where Russia really was dependent for certain types of technology and manufacturing from Iran in terms of UAVs and other types of platforms. Had the Islamic Republic had this crisis then, and there had been a fall of the regime, that would have dealt a real blow to Russia. It still would be problematic from Russia, but Russia is on firmer footing than it was before, and they're going to be able to better handle it should it move that direction. But at the same time, Russia wants to maintain that relationship, and as Gisu alluded, the Russians are probably the ones who are providing Iran with the technology and the methods for interfering with Starlink and jamming other types of signals. So they're continuing to cooperate. With China, it's somewhat bizarre in that you would expect China to be more concerned, given that some 12 to 13% of seaborne imports of oil into China come from Iran at heavily discounted prices. But China has not seemed to have been overly concerned during past crises in Iran. And I think that's attributable to the fact that Chinese leaders increasingly have concluded that their rise is inevitable and that any setback, including the loss of a potential ally in the Middle East, would only be a temporary blip in their inevitable rise to become the sole superpower internationally. And we also saw this during the Gaza war, where the growing tension in between Israel and Iran threatened to shut down all shipping routes. It threatened to take out all Iranian oil shipments, and U.S. officials were going to the Chinese and saying, we have a mutual interest in calming this down. And China clearly was more interested in seeing the United States suffer reputationally than they were in continuing to get Iranian oil. Now, whether that's the right decision or not, in terms of weighting economic versus reputational factors, only history will be the judge of that. But China China is concerned about Iran. They certainly value it, but it's not make or break for them. Iran seems to be a discretionary friend rather than a key element of their axis of relations. And ultimately, China is confident in its international opinion, regardless of what happens over the next several weeks or several months in this particular country.
Yeah, no, some really good points. I want to open it to Gisu and Jason as well. Anything that you'd want to add in terms of the geopolitical and particularly countries in the region?
I just say, I think that was very succinctly put by Andrew, especially on Israel and Gulf concerns, and this existential threat that was long talked about by the Saudis and the Israelis was shrouded in this nuclear packaging for so long that we here in the United States apparently accepted hook, line, and sinker. But for anybody who looks at these things closely, understands that for millennia, Iran has been the hegemon in the region, culturally, politically, and in many other ways. So that's the threat that it has always posed to them, whether it's an Islamic Republic or something else. And the one piece of the puzzle that I think is really important that we haven't really talked about and isn't really being talked about very much is, what I see as, the probable Israeli desire to see Iran cut up into smaller pieces, right? And I think that that's a conversation that we'll be hearing about, more in the coming months. And I think it's something that needs to be considered. The Iranians have a very deep and often hard to comprehend sense of self. The nationhood aspect cuts along ethnic and religious lines for many. And I just, I understand why Israel might see, a partitioned Iran as potentially beneficial to them. I just don't think it's in anybody's best interest. That's one thing. The other thing that we didn't mention is, Turkey and Azerbaijan. I think that they are, a wild card here and have, a lot of interests at play, given that so much of the Iranian population is Azeri and leans kind of culturally towards Turkey more than Persian elements of the society. So those are just things to watch.
Yeah, Isu?
Just wanted to jump in and say that it really shouldn't be a surprise that there's nobody that wants democracy for Iran other than Iranians. I wouldn't say, let's look at the neighbors in the region. They're not exactly thriving democracies. So the international community has taken many hits. Multilateralism obviously is being dismantled by the Trump administration almost single-handedly. I would say that this was a process over, more than a decade, with beginning with Syria, the total failure of the international community to react to that, what Russia did with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, what Israel has done in flouting pretty much every international law and all rules around sovereignty, and the final death knell has been with the Trump administration and its policies and removing themselves from, 66 organizations of the UN and defunding it, attacking the International Criminal Court, and putting targeted sanctions on my former boss. I didn't realize that I worked for an arms dealer or a narco trafficker. Those are the kinds of people that we put targeted sanctions on. And so it's all been quite stunning. But the surrounding countries don't want democracy in Iran. And so what we need is for the international community, whatever that means, but people who continue to believe in multilateralism, which there are many mid to smaller countries that do. And there are those voices that need to be louder and aid the Iranian people's transition to democracy, because the region certainly isn't going to be prioritizing that. But that's what Iranians have been saying for more than a decade. I wish that those calls were heeded earlier. We have a lot of people who were very focused on the nuclear file and not focused on what the people of Iran were asking for, which was to dislodge this regime. A lot of analysts, a lot of governments were happier with the status quo, were warned about this Syriaization of the country. And now we find ourselves here because the international community failed to take those concerns seriously, and what Iranian people continue to tell them over and over again. So I would say that if there's any way to support that transition, I'll also note that we don't yet know who those leaders are going to be. The political space in Iran has never been open. There has never been free and fair elections, unlike in Venezuela, where an opposition candidate, not the opposition candidate, but one opposition candidate was actually allowed to run. And we saw the initial results saying that they won 70-30 and there's a clear mandate. We don't have that in Iran. The presidential election is more of a selection. It's a sham. No opposition candidate has ever been allowed to run. So we really don't know what the Iranian people want, but we do know that they are chanting for the regime to go. Many are chanting the name of Reza Pahlavi, which is really just a rejection of the system. They are asking for this regime to go, and we should prioritize their transition to democracy, and understand that just discussing the nuclear file and all the security concerns are not actually going to yield the result that, many people around the world want and that the people of Iran want. And we're not going to be aided in that with the countries of the region, nor with the Trump administration. Perhaps prior administrations in the US would have viewed it differently, but I'd like to see more open calls for that and support for the Iranian people.
It's a really good point. We've only got a couple minutes left here, and I'd be curious for folks' views on the question of sanctions. And there's an ongoing debate in policymaking circles around the efficacy, particularly of U.S. sanctions. Curious for your views as to how you see sanctions have had an impact on the inflationary dynamics that we see within Iran, or we've seen within Iran, that led to the protests. Do you see sanctions as a factor? Do you not see sanctions as a factor? Curious for that, for your views on that. Maybe we can start with Jason and then go around.
Look, I think it's been a factor for years. It's less of a factor today than it was, say in 2012, 13, when the sanctions were really first implemented and being ratcheted up. Islamic Republic has figured out how to sell their oil to China. The inflation has, probably more to do with corruption and theft at this point than sanctions. That isn't to say that I support, more economic blanket sanctions. I certainly don't. And I think, we have enough information and insight into Iran, its leadership, its pressure points, that targeted sanctions against individuals I'm always going to be in support of, but ones that, disproportionately hurt the public and cut off their access to necessary goods, services, medications, that sort of thing. And I've witnessed this firsthand living in Tehran. Is not effective, it's not helpful, and it's inhumane.
Andrew?
I'm not sure that anything that's unfolded is new regarding the efficacy of sanctions. The two things that have been clear about sanctions for decades now were, one, they can be effective at precipitating change, but it takes many, many years. They don't have an instantaneous impact on behavior. And two, although they can have an impact, they also have extraordinary collateral damage, as Jason was alluding to. You end up hurting a lot of people you do not wish to hurt, or who should not be hurt and are not responsible for having done anything. I do think there is a linkage between the sanctions and the corruption, because one thing that sanctions does is that in order to continue operating at some level, it pushes activities out of the hands of the regular commercial actors into different hands, IRGC, state-affiliated companies that are created, and that's where corruption often flourishes. So it's not the direct impact of sanctions, but an indirect impact of sanctions, and that's not to suggest that you can reduce all of the economic woes to sanctions. There are a variety of factors at play for what is happening, but sanctions have clearly contributed to it. And just to connect it to what Jisoo was saying, if there was as much thinking about issues of accountability and justice as there has been on sanctions as a tool of changing behavior, I think we would probably be in a better place. And for reasons that are not directly related to Iran, but don't necessarily exclude it, we are reaching the limits of sanctions as an enterprise. And I think we're coming perilously close to the point where our ability to use sanctions, which is enabled by the dollar as the global reserve currency, is under greater strain than ever before. And this administration seems to be completely oblivious to that risk. I think the Federal Reserve Chairman understands that, but he's not in the best odor with the administration at the moment.
Jisoo, anything you want to add on that, on the sanctions question?
Yeah, just very quickly. Obviously, this is a long-ranging debate, the efficacy of whether broad-based sanctions work, targeted sanctions being a separate thing, and there being some debate around that as well, but something that I'm often involved in, packages for targeted sanctions for human rights violators. Obviously, the Trump administration has been stretching that beyond anything recognizable by sanctioning people in my line of work. So instead of sanctioning the people that we are going after and investigating, we ourselves are being sanctioned, including my colleagues. But back to the sanctions question, the one thing that I'd like to point out, though, is there's a lot of rhetoric online and also from some analysts about how if sanctions were removed, then somehow this would be the all solve for Iran. Then somehow we're going to have a flourishing civil society, everything is going to be fine. And one of the primary reasons that Iran is in the place it's in is because of these broad-based economic sanctions. Broad-based economic sanctions didn't create the Islamic Republic's morality police. They didn't create Iran's Islamic penal code. There is a debate to be had about whether they're effective in actually restricting or leading to behavior change for regime officials. But it's not like if the sanctions are removed, then somehow all these social freedoms are going to come flooding in. There's a very tenuous argument around that, saying that if the middle class is empowered, then somehow they'll be able to engage more. We already saw that story before, and it didn't work out. We've had situations with reformist leaning presidents that led to some opening of the society. It's just not the path forward. And I think Iranians understand that. And even people who were once reformists are saying that they want the regime gone. I will make one comment on what broad-based economic sanctions have done, is that they have actually restricted a lot of the funding that the Islamic Republic would send to proxies in the region. So while I have a real question around how it's impacted their behavior inside the country, and I really question the efficacy of all this, there's no doubt that they don't have the kind of slush fund that they would have otherwise to be able to send elsewhere. So just one data point that doesn't impact Iranians inside the country necessarily, but is something more about the regional dynamics.
That's great. Very, very good points. So we've just run over a bit. I do want to thank our audience for joining us today for this really important conversation, and also really want to thank Gisu and Jason and Andrew for joining in relatively short order. We've had to put this together pretty quickly, so I really appreciate your flexibility in joining us for this conversation. As I mentioned, this is a dynamic and fast-moving situation in Iran. So I would encourage folks in the audience to look towards Gisu's analysis that's coming out of the Atlantic Council, Jason's work coming out of the Washington Post, and then, of course, Andrew's work here at the Center for American Progress as this situation develops. So with that, I will wrap up. Again, share my thanks with our panelists in the audience, and we will see you next time. Thank you.